The Cold War was on. The Soviet Union had tested its first nuclear weapon. NATO had been established, and both East and West Germany now had failed to unite, resulting in a divided Europe. From 1949 onwards, any semblance of a post-World War II peace was out of the window. The two major superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, would attempt to assert dominance over one another. Whether this would be done with diplomacy or nuclear weapons, it was clear the future of the world may be in the balance. Welcome back to the second video on East Germany. These brief overviews of the country during its short lifespan attempt to visualize the situation and perspectives of the East German government. As we followed in episode 1, the fledgling East German government had barely made a name for itself. Still with no standing army or border wall, in these provocative years the East German government would lay the foundations to the dictatorship to come. The Cold War itself seemed to be the only thing that could keep this nation alive. The beginning of 1949 was a tumultuous year. In April, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was founded in Washington by Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Italy, Iceland, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United States. Only a month later, these same countries would help the West German government establish itself. Although it could not join NATO until later, the lines in Europe were now clearly drawn. The reaction to Soviet hostilities in Berlin had now escalated the West in making an organization designed to counter the Soviet Union with military action. So let's start from the beginning of 1949 and move our way into 1953 and then conclude with a shift in policy in 1956. If at any point you feel lost, feel free to check out my previous video from 1945 to 1949. Stalin would die in 1953, and in these final few years, his pressure towards the Stalinist system would increase. Stalinist ideas of how to run the economy, education, militaries all took precedent in the Eastern Bloc. As these were the last years of Stalin, East Germany would be pressured to be the purest form of Stalinism. Stalin himself had gained power after basically telling Lenin he was too sick for office. And so Stalin's own health decline created some pressure on the 70-year-old leader. At the time, East Germany was still finding its footing amidst the rubble of the Second World War, and it was struggling to survive economically. Thus, Moscow had implemented the first two-year plan for the East German government, and this was mostly to reverse the destroyed industry and replace industry stolen by the superpowers. And it was not quite clear yet where the DDR would go in the economic sector. Many still thought it would be in a limbo between a closed and a free market, though this would change with the five-year plan in 1951, which solidified the Stalinist model in the East. Under the slogan, "Learning from the Soviet Union means learning to be victorious," these first few years, at the tail end of Stalin's life, a strict set of Stalinist ideas were introduced to the fresh country. This Stalinist direction for the country rivaled previous whispers for a liberalized communist country, and the Stalinist economic and national system would become something the East Germans would never give up on, often argued as a reason for the demise of the country. The two-year plan was really great for the Soviet Union. It increased East German dependency on the USSR, and as previously discussed, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, or SED, was evolved into a carbon copy of the Soviet Communist Party, and the fresh country could now remodel the nation itself into a communist powerhouse. Meanwhile, manipulated elections confused the German populace, as over 66% of voters wanted a socialist unified Germany. The East and Soviet government still feared the other voters and quickly thereafter established the East German nation itself, with Wilhelm Pieck still acting as the leader of the SED and president of the GDR. His leadership would be shortly thereafter replaced by a somewhat unloved communist, Walter Ulbricht, who, as I talked about in the previous video, was a much older German communist. But the fear in Moscow over a complete overturning of East Germany into a capitalist country was dying out. Either way, because of the Stalinist model, fears over the voting population declined, with the party turning a somewhat temporary blind eye to the problems of the people, which would become an almost fatal mistake. Without going into heavy detail, the West was also beefing up West Germany. With its new currency and loose connection to the military pact NATO, it was the subject of immense financial investment. So, the Soviet Union still remained in East Germany, with the SMAD, or Soviet Occupation Zone, now being replaced by the Soviet High Commission, and it was clear and often stated that this relationship between the USSR and DDR were necessary to the continuation of the East German state. The existence of NATO as a military force also pressured the East on the concept of a military. The NVA, or National People's Army, was still 6 years away, so to help make up the image of an East German military, the Volkspolizei, numbering around 50,000, had a tight grip on the people. Alongside these moves in 1950 was the establishment of an organization you all may know, the Stasi, or the Ministry of State Security. As stated by author Martin McCauley,
the Stasi was to detect all opposition to the state internally and to conduct espionage abroad. It also conducted the investigations in all cases where the accused was thought to have acted in a manner hostile to the state.
If this sounds broad, that was on purpose. But the Stasi we are all familiar with today is not the same organization as it was then. As with most things East German, the grip on the people increased alongside calls for liberalization. For now, the Stasi's true power was unknown, but soon every citizen of East Germany would be watched, whether by state officials or by their family. For now, the people, though, had some semblance of freedom from the Stasi as they were still in their infancy. However, despite the increasingly strong and Stalinistic regime changes, with a now seemingly invincible government, the start of a long struggle between the government and the people began to erupt. As previously stated, despite the high quote-unquote support from the people, both Soviets and German allies were very fearful of the people and their parties. Thousands in 1950 left the SED, whether from disagreements on the hardline stance, or just as an attempt to remove oneself from the chaos of the party, officials began to worry. As I stated previously, these worries from the party came in ebbs and flows. At some points in this video, the party was very concerned over the situation of their population, while others they weren't. This was just the reality of the East German government, and the many problems they had within their own cult of personality. The fresh Politburo, or policy-making committee, stressed that the floor may fall out underneath the new country. And just before the Third Party Congress in July 1950, Pieck, Grotewohl, and Ubrecht met with Stalin to discuss how to secure power. Whatever this talk was about, it sure came to a head in the Congress, which came out with further nationalization projects and the elections of Walter Ubrecht as the party's general secretary. These strong nationalization projects, as a result of the unrest within the populace, continued onward, and the aforementioned Volkspolizei started to patrol the borders and utilize the new Soviet tech flooding into the police force. The East German government felt this whole project, stemming from the Third Congress, would really show the West the power of the East. Wilhelm Pieck stated at this time that,
"Deep down the West German masses are in ferment. Their discontent, their outrage is growing. It is bound to erupt, although perhaps immediately, not today."
And unfortunately, the only country in this whole interaction that would really have to worry about their people would be the East. However, Pieck was right on a few things. The West was not looking perfect, despite what we know about West Germany today. Many West Germans at the time, despite getting their economy back on track, were hesitant with the Western government. The new capital, located in the small city of Bonn, really did not have a strong political identity or national identity. Berlin had been the capital through a few empires and through the Nazi dictatorship, and now communist leadership. Compared to the Bonn-led, often confused and divided politics of the West, the future was really hazy for the West Germans. Some Western politicians even flirted with the idea of a possible shift against occupying forces. One such outspoken person on the West was Günter Guericke, who, despite his conservative CDU membership, thought that the Western government was frail. He would ironically later defect to the East. Nonetheless, East Germany was faced with a strong challenge. How could they convince West Germany to come on their side, while the US was still involved in this whole equation? Some blamed the Stalinist ideas. Others called, for example, in the Third Congress, for a peace movement, and some were even more hawkish, wanting to invade the West Germans. Stalin himself blamed the East German government for the increasing division between the Germanys. Stalin often accused the East German government of being fearful or cowards. Funny enough, Stalin actually supported the peace movement in East Germany to help bring peace to West Germany so that the two Germanys could unite. With Stalin's pressure for peace, the Prime Minister of East Germany also reached out to the leader of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, with a plan called the All-German Constitute Council, which wanted a collaborative meeting between Germanies and talks about remilitarization. But by 1951, the West declined this offer. The West wanted free Eastern elections. The West also offered UN involvement, but the East refused its entry. East Germany would also bring up this peace treaty again in 1952 to no avail. Altogether, the information I just laid out is a bit chaotic, and probably sounds like a mishmash of information. But if anything, it displays the many conversations between East and West at this time, and the internal struggles the East was having within itself. The SED felt jammed between peace talks, and their constant conflicts with the West, with the Soviets at their back, did not help things. Everyone thought they knew everything, when in reality by 1952, nobody had gained any ground. Meanwhile, the population of East Germany had declined significantly. The political battles within and the economic decline of the East resulted in thousands leaving. 166,000 people left in 1951 and 182,000 left in 1952, according to East German numbers, many of whom were doctors, lawyers, and other important jobs, and mostly young people. With food stamps on the rise, many young middle-class workers leaving, industrial decline, and harassment from the USSR in the West, things did not look so good for East Germany. The Stalinist model, so urgently pressed, started showing some cracks, while the West slowly improved. To combat all this, the borders between East and West sectors were finally closed in 1953, and shortly thereafter, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader since 1922, died. The sudden change of leadership in the USSR led to a more liberal communist, Nikita Khrushchev, becoming leader, resulting in a sudden instability within East German life and politics. Aforementioned SED members, who were often leaving as a result of the cult of personality, now felt the liberalization wave going on in the USSR. Other satellite countries around the Soviet Union now wanted to reform the nations as a result of the death of Stalin. People around the bloc opened up about Stalin's crimes and had to address them in the future. But most of these discussions came way later. Anyways, as a result of the East German instability, with thousands leaving, a new USSR leader, fallout with the West, and increasing economic problems, some sort of spark was imminent in 1953. To help calm the nation down, the New Course program was announced, which privatized some farms and small businesses, as well as aimed to increase the standard of living and create cheaper goods. Although the government here was attempting to lighten the load post-Stalin, it ended up making many Eastern politicians openly critique Ulbricht's government, and worse yet, created public outcry to further reform. Nonetheless, East Germans got a small taste of a more privatized country. This attempt to liberalize and appease the people amidst the Khrushchev thaw, or the liberalization effort going on in the Soviet Union to allow the government to be more open, was really changing how the Germans viewed their government in the East. This would ultimately result in numerous strikes in East Berlin, starting with groups of construction workers protesting or striking against their unions, as well as party officials. These protests, such as those taking place in front of Brandenburg prison, escalated protests into the thousands. By the 16th of June 1953, protests were directly outside government buildings, asking for fairer work quotas and for the Ulbricht government to address wage and pricing issues as a result of the economic decline. Quickly, the protests amongst the workers, ranging from topics of drinking beer on the worksite to wages earned, gained the attention of all of East Berlin and many outside the city. From here, the strikes gained attention in the West, and many non-construction workers went out into the street by June 17th. The now 25,000 people in East Berlin marched towards the city center. They were met with Volkspolizei, who were outnumbered and confused as to what to do with the many protesters. By the early morning, the House of Ministries had thousands outside, with around 100 storming inside the government building. By this time, the GDR government was in full crisis, and Soviet tanks and other Soviet military personnel were quickly dispatched. As with many Soviet bloc protests, the use of violence or not was still up in the air. Many similar strikes in other countries were met with severe violence by Soviet soldiers towards the protesters. By the end of the 17th, some 10,000 protesters were detained, with a few dozen being killed. But beyond Berlin, some 700 towns and communities in the GDR had various sized protests as a result of similar price increases. This unfortunate event showed two major things. Firstly, the East German government was not ready for full independence from their Soviet occupiers. And two, the East German government would need to keep their people restrained in order to remain in control over the failing economy. This gave the Soviet government a mix of shock and dedication to preserving the important nation of East Germany, with over 1 billion rubles being sent for numerous aid and economic projects after this event, with East Germany no longer having to pay reparations for the Second World War. This pivotal event would cement itself as one of the most important events in East German history, and honestly, it deserves a video in its own. But for the sake of brevity, we will continue and rather look at the consequences in changing the economic policy of the East German government. With the events of 1953 now over, the aforementioned restructure of East German society would start, despite what I said about the importance of Soviet forces in East Germany. The Soviet Union wanted to shake things up, and thus promised East Germany full sovereignty by 1955, even though the DDR was not ready for this, as seen in 1953. But nonetheless, they accepted it. This is not to say that the DDR would just become free, though. Rather, the Soviet Union would still remain very active inside East Germany, alongside a government that hopefully could support its own weight. As a result of this, the Soviet Union wanted to have an East German military as well as updated economic and political policies to cement itself as its own Stalinist-era nation. Despite the ongoing first 5-year plan, East German officials introduced things like the coal and energy program going into 1954. They also renewed consumer good productions with many of the previous private farms and small businesses, even though the country generally held a Stalinist position. This acceptance of a more privatized industry was very odd, but at the time the economy was actually thought to be the light at the end of the tunnel. In 1954, until the second year plan in 1956, many found the Stalinist model being replaced in the economy. As stated by Swedish economist Anders Östlund, the best and most liberal economic debate ever in the GDR thrived between 1955 and 1957. Anyway, the years of 1954 to 1956 would both be important and uneventful somehow. These years, following the scary events in 1953, were largely surrounding the creation of the East German nation. In 1954, Comecon, the Soviet Economic Assistance Group, was founded to help out communist countries, and thus East Germany was granted early sovereignty, possibly as a move for the Soviets to have to worry less about the troubled nation. And shortly thereafter, the East would join the Soviets counter to NATO, as the Warsaw Pact was created in 1955. Alongside this, they also created the National Volksarmee, or NVA, which was the main military of the East for the rest of their existence. Altogether, this created a stronger Soviet bloc, with a new alliance, new militaries, more funding, and an all-around solid response to NATO and the internal struggles going on within the Soviet-aligned countries. And with that short summary on the years following the Uprising, I will be concluding this video. I know the end is a bit rushed, but if you remember me briefly talking about the second 5-year plan in 1956, there will be a major jump for the East, and that should have a video of its own. And so I decided I just should quickly cover how the East basically became a real country following the events in 1953. With that, I want to add that I really enjoy the series, and honestly I hope to continue it. I really dug into the rabbit's hole and tested my video making ability through this series, and I will come back to it, but I believe that I should make a different subject video between the next edition of the series. I just came home from living in Berlin, so I have been exposed to a lot of East German history, even more than I initially intended, and so I really want to come back to my roots and what I'm used to, and then I can come back to this, because I really enjoy this, but I should cover more familiar topics and then come back. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for watching. I expect a shorter and easier to understand video soon, but nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed the format of this video more than the first episode, as they got a lot more traction than intended. And thank you to all the new people who subscribed, and sorry for the wait. As always, see you soon.